Hello, welcome back to a quick episode of Poddenham Podspur this morning. I wanted to get something to you sooner, but it's been a busy week here in Caysa, Dell, Poddenham. I've been in and out of a lot of appointments and work and stuff like that, but I wanted to get something to you sooner because it's such a good moment to be a Spurs fan. I know people will say, well, you nearly got relegated, what are you happy about? But you should just be happy. You should be happy if you're happy if you're happy. That's all. That's how I feel about it. And you should too, because that's what I'm telling you to do. So if you really, I had a good chat with my friends on Wicked Spursy earlier in the week. If you follow me on Blue Sky, ian.coys.social, you probably saw me posting about that. I am going to be a regular over there chatting about like weekly Spurs performances as opposed to kind of the wider picture that I chat about over here on Poddenham. But today I wanted to spend some time reflecting on the season from a podcast perspective, because you're going to get all sorts of cool analyses and squad audits from other people, right? Poddenham isn't about that. Poddenham's about the pods. It's in the name like twice. So I put out a post on Blue Sky, I think it was on Poddenham, at poddenhampodspur.bsky.social, in which I listed a couple awards, Poddenham Podspur Spurs Podcast Awards. And I just wanted to talk through those today as a way to reflect upon the kind of season we had and the way that podcasters handled it. I'll then talk a little bit about my reflection on the season for myself and what to look ahead, and then, we'll see how we go. So let's start off with the big one, and maybe I should build up to this. I've never hosted an awards show before, but my favorite podcast of the year was friend of the channel Jack Hussey's Rule the Roost. There were lots of contenders here. I thought that Ozo Spurs did a great job this year. I thought that some of my friends on Home and Away had like a great approach to bringing in fans from all over the world. But I thought that Jack really struck a balance of good voices coming on his show. He just recently had Jack Pitt-Brooke on. He had Ben Haynes on earlier in the year to talk about the Europa League outcomes. I think he had Rob Daly too. He had me on, so obviously that must make it the best podcast ever. But it's just been a really, he's really caught the tone of the fan base for a lot of people. I think Jack has reflected incredibly well the frustrations of Spurs fans. And I've said this before about him. I've got an interview with Jack coming out in a week or two. I was just waiting for the dust to settle on the season, but he's done a great job. Him with his regular guests like Phil, they're just really capturing a great tone, in my opinion. His post-match reviews come out quickly. They are free to anybody to listen on YouTube or Spotify or wherever. And he's got this great fan engagement and community that's built up around him. So I found those to be very comforting this season. I think Jack was also probably the first person to call out the possibility of relegation this season. Now you could say, well, that's because he's being negative, but in the end it was borne out by results. In terms of best new podcast, there were a few contenders here. My friends on yet another podcast about Spurs who are putting out monthly pods. But I've gone for the Big John Bass show. So John has, bounced off of his popularity on the Fighting Cock and his network there to build up very quickly a group of very engaged people who enjoy the content he's putting out. His idea was to put out something a little bit later, so to have more time to reflect on the week and to try to fill a gap there. I don't think he's not the only person doing that, but that was his intention. And I like podcasts with an intentional, decision behind them, as opposed to I have opinions and I want to share them. Nothing wrong with that, but I do like something where the person thought about the messaging they want to put out. So I've really enjoyed that. In terms of best YouTube, this is technically best YouTuber and best new YouTuber. Sarah from Spurs from the Stands. I think she started her channel in January, and I do look out for her. I think that she's done a great job of, again, capturing tone of the fan base and sort of channeling it into the medium of YouTube. She's shown up on a few other channels and shows. I heard her on Oso Spurs with Jim about a month ago, and she spoke very well. She's a very good listen if you're looking for something in the YouTube space. Best episode of a podcast this year is going to go to, and there are a few contenders here. It's going to go to, is Gascoigne going to have a crack for Gareth's Irving Scholar episode with Mihir Bose? But there are a few contenders. Yeah, 'cause especially these special episodes. There was a lot of good work at the end of the season. Again, I'm going to shout out Oso Spurs for their episode on like the finances of Spurs, if relegation came about. But I really enjoyed Gareth's interview with Mihir Bose, and I forget it was one other chap, talking about Irving Scholar's time at Spurs, because it's 40 plus years ago. Incredibly knowledgeable people discussing this period of time in the 80s of Spurs, in 1980s for Spurs, and just really digging into it. And I just found it a fascinating take on making a Spurs podcast. So congrats to Gareth for putting out an absolutely brilliant podcast series, and you should definitely subscribe to it if you haven't already. Best guest, however, is going to go to one of those contenders for best episode. Didn't quite make it, which was Sean Connell on Rule the Roost. So Sean is editor at a journal called The Sponsor. So he specializes in understanding how football sponsorships work, the mechanisms of them, what sponsors are looking for, their market prices, all that type of stuff. So he really opened my eyes to the sort of catastrophic situation that could happen if Spurs went down this season coming, or if they had gone down and were in the championship for this season coming. So please go check that one out. It's a fascinating insight into what Spurs are going to be going through this year as they search for a new, possibly stadium sponsor, but definitely front of shirt sponsor. I don't want to give too much away. The worst trend, in my opinion, was the phrase green shoots. Throughout the season, we were so desperate for any kind of hope to be put into our laps as Spurs fans that every single time somebody passed the ball to somebody else on our team rather than the opposition, it was like green shoots of progress. Oh my God, we had a shot on target. It's green shoot. And oh wow, the players smiled at the fans. It's green shoot. Like, it was non-stop green shoots. And I hope that we don't get green shoots next season. We get green, I don't know, forest. Moving, so this is Poddenham Podspur, so it's going to be a Poddenham Podspur episode, in part about Poddenham Podspur. The worst week for me to review podcasts by far was the week after, or leading up to, and then after Roberto De Zerbi was hired, because it was a lot of really harrowing discussions of people's personal lives regarding, I'm going to just say SA for the algorithm, of bad behavior, to put it mildly, contentious and just inflammatory discussions in some cases, and I wanted to capture as much as I could. I probably listened to too much, and I talked about that in my Roberto De Zerbi episode. That was really hard. That was a really hard week, and it took a lot out of me. But on the flip side, my favorite episode, and I did have a couple, and this was a little bit harder for me to think about and try to choose, but I've gone for Talking Tottenham and Well-Being. Slightly, again, bouncing off of that previous entry. There was an awful lot of talk this year amongst Spurs fans about therapy and self-care, of listening to and talking about Spurs. The depressing nature, the stressful, frustrating nature of being a Tottenham fan, or really, just an insight into football fans in general who have to go through this kind of stress year on year of relegation. So I really enjoyed digging into, in a shallow layperson's perspective. I have a background in reading scientific papers and reviews, but I'm not a sports psychologist or anywhere related to that. I've always been squishy, wet biology, not mind-body interaction biology. But I thought that was really cool, and I hope that I don't have to make another episode like that. And I'm looking forward to making it a sister episode of, the joy that football can bring to people. And again, from the scientific perspective of quantifying that. My weirdest moment was probably learning about the Ian Spur podcast. Thank you again, Polyphinosaur, for putting that out. I think he's actually one episode ahead of me at the moment, which is kind of funny to think about. And yeah, this whole podcast of mine, Poddenham Podspur, came about because of conversations on Blue Sky and the community there. And it's been surprisingly, considering the size of Blue Sky Spurs, it's surprising how many podcasts have sprung up out of that space or are using it for marketing their podcasts exclusively now. I'm thinking about Yaps. I'm thinking about The Game Is About Glory. Poddenham Podspur came out of it. I think there's a few more. Sorry for not remembering them off the top of my head. But to find out that this podcast has had enough of an impact, even in a small way, to make somebody record a phone, or episode on their phone is just hilarious and such a funny little idea. And this is the type of creativity I really want to see in the Spurs podcast space, is people just taking an idea and running with it. I want to make a podcast about podcasts. Great, go for it. I'd love to see what's going to come next out of Spurs fans. So those are my end of season awards. I guess one extra one that pops into my head that I didn't write down was Spurs podcast MVP, and that's probably Billy T, because I want to say in any given week, Billy showed up in like 50% of the Spurs podcasts you were listening to. He's a regular on like Hometown Glory. I think he shows up on Dr. Tottenham frequently. I've heard him on The Fighting Cock, I swear. I've heard him on Rule the Roost. Last Word on Spurs. He is all over the place. It's amazing. I don't know where he finds the time in the week, but it's also a good platform for his work that he does with fan representation through Change for Tottenham. You can argue about whether or not Change for Tottenham represents you, but that's the broad goal of Change for Tottenham. And I'll leave that there on Change for Tottenham. I like what they're doing in terms of high level, and you get into the weeds, you can find problems with anything. So yeah, those are my podcast awards. If anything bubbles up as I'm talking, maybe I'll throw it in, because I'm not a very good podcaster. But I just want to reflect back on that season that passed, and I do wonder whether or not we're in a kind of ship of Theseus situation with Spurs fans. How has this? Well, not maybe a ship of Theseus, because there's no replacement parts, but more like the idea that the journey can change you, and are you the same person that you went into starting a voyage or whatever. I forget what the story that comes from is called, but there's this idea that the experiences you go through can impact you in such a way that you are not fundamentally the same person on the other side. So going into this season, yes, we had been 17th in the Premier League, but we won a trophy. So I think to a certain extent that had sustained us for a season as Spurs fans, as viewing ourselves as a top club. Top. But there was the underlying issues of like squad performance, slipping status, stuff like that have been borne out this year. Kind of the way that I fear that other fans see us, as mid-table, overachievers, or mid-table noisy neighbours. And I don't think that's true in any way, shape, or form as a Spurs fan. I think that, excuse me, in terms of our performance over decades, we are a top club, top club. But this season, I think, reinforced the view of Tottenham get battered everywhere they go. And I'm curious to see how Spurs fans may or may not reassess their expectations in the short to medium term. Are we expecting ourselves to be up in top 4 contention next season or the season after next? I think we're probably all hoping for Europe in some form soon. Are we chasing Champions League though, or Conference League? Are we expecting us to be able to compete for a Nico Williams in the near future? And that's a big question for us in terms of progress, because even last season with Champions League in play, we were able to pick up Xavi Simons, who was a very highly rated talent in Europe. Everyone was super excited to get him. Who are we going to get this year? Are Spurs fans going to be understanding of a change in scope for what we think we can achieve as a club in the next 12 months? I don't know. Like expectations being on the floor is something that I've heard recently on podcasts, and so therefore it makes it a little bit more straightforward for De Zerbi to come in and capitalize on the buy-in he already has. We heard this last year though with Thomas Frank, and that clearly wasn't the case. Of course, the performances were so bad that you could say that that's why we turned around and rightfully pointed out that he sucked ass. So yeah, that's my big question going into the 26-27 season. What are we as a football club? How do we view ourselves? And how do we conduct ourselves as Spurs fans? How do we have conversations? How do we make podcasts about Tottenham in this current state? I mean, I think that we should always be trying to raise ourselves up as high as possible. But are we gonna give the wiggle room now to De Zerbi and the team to have the odd bad performance, or are we going to be straight back up to expecting what we expected in the heyday of Pochettino? Because I think that's what we'd all like to get back to as a minimum, is the kind of performance levels that we saw under Poch, taking into account where we are currently now with injuries and squad composition and everything else. So I think I'm going to leave it there. Just a quick one today to make sure that I actually put out a podcast and, acted like I'm a real podcaster. I want to thank everybody this season who listened to Poddenham Podspur, who talked about it, who said that it was a podcast that they enjoyed. This is a silly little hobby of mine, and I love talking to Spurs fans. I love this niche that I've carved out myself. And it is so validating to hear people say that they enjoy it. So thank you. Keep heaping praise on me. Share it with people when you think there's an episode that I put out that resonates strongly. Give me negative feedback as well, though. There have been episodes where people, especially the De Zerbi episode, where people questioned what I, was saying in that episode, and I value that, and thank you. I think everyone was super respectful of my position, and I hope that I was respectful of yours. And if you didn't feel like that, then I apologize. At the end of the day, this is a football conversation, and we can be civil. So thank you. The comments on Spotify, great. They always make me smile when I see one. So thank you for that. Thanks to anybody who's begun listening to me on Wicked Spursy now. Those episodes are going to be much more gut reactions rather than what Poddenham tends to be. I also want to thank everybody who appeared on the show this year. It's been crazy for interviews. I think Flav Bateman from the Fighting Cock we had Greg from Wheeler Dealer Radio, Mike Lee from the Spurs Show, David Harris from Grumpy Old Spurs. I'm forgetting somebody. Gareth Dace from Is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack? And The Game Is About Glory. Who else am I forgetting? There's somebody else in there. Yeah, I've got Jack from All the Roost coming up. It's and I'm hoping to have a few more cool podcasts involving interviews with other Spurs podcasters in the near future. And if you haven't checked those out, they are fun. It's there are these voices who are so prominent in online Spurs culture, especially, but very often their backstories and where they come from are lost. They might have said it at some point, but I feel like the Poddenham episodes where I talk to them are really nice insights into the inner workings of their brains and where they come from as Spurs fans. So please check those out if you haven't already. And thank you, thank you so much. We've got another season of Poddenham coming up. This summer is going to be about reassessing what I want to do, what I want to talk about next season, how I want to re-strategize. Because if I am going to be on Wicked Spursy on a weekly basis, I need to think about where I put my energy, into what buckets for Poddenham. I really like the big analyses, but as the season's worn on, it's been harder and harder to find the time to do those. I'd like to get in one over the summer and contemplating something on the Spurs podcasts that stopped and started this season. I did want to talk about who maybe identified the threat of relegation early, but sadly I didn't track that as well as I'd like. But we'll see. Definitely more interviews. I think more shooting from the hip about what's happening in the podcast space. I'm also contemplating the idea of Poddenham Podspur, where I can, throughout the week as I listen to stuff, just jot down a quick note and put it into a weekly newsletter format that either comes out to your emails or is posted on something that probably integrates with Blue Sky, maybe a WordPress, I'm not sure yet. But something where I can just quickly write something down and people can click on the links, and check out the podcast that I'm recommending that week. So more work for myself, I guess. But I'd like to get to that point, I think. That would be a nice way to augment what I do on this channel. Well, thank you. If you're going to be taking a summer off from Spurs, enjoy the World Cup, enjoy your family and your friends, whatever else you're going to be doing in the coming months. It's going to be it's a good summer to be a Spurs fan. We're not relegated, I've worn my Spurs shirts. I think this is my 6th day in a row now of wearing a different Spurs clobber around the town. So have a good one, and just remember, up the Spurs.